1982 was the most pivotal year from Israel's point of view. It was a moral victory for the Palestinians. And one of the reasons it was a moral victory for the Palestinians was the uncontrolled butchery enabled by the IDF under Ariel Sharon. So I think, military victory and political and moral defeat for Israel.
So, hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Book Cafe Podcast. In today's episode, we will be discussing this book right here behind me entitled Arafat, the Biography by Tony Walker and Andrew Gowers. And I'm extremely pleased to have Andrew with us in today's episode as my conversation partner to talk about the book. So, as we all know, Yasser Arafat is a titanic figure when it comes to modern history. He's an amazing statesman, and we'll hopefully get around to unpacking a lot about his particular life story during the course of this discussion. But first, let me do my due diligence by welcoming Andrew to the show. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It's really great to connect with you.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Okay. So, Andrew, before we get to talking about the book, for the sake of our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet and who may be discovering you as well for the very first time, do please take this moment to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So I'm a retired person, but I was a journalist for 25 years. And for several of those years, I was responsible for covering the Middle East. And most of my journalistic career was with the Financial Times, the London-based general but mainly business newspaper. So I was Middle East editor of that journal from 1987 to 1990. And during that period, I became really interested in Arafat as a sort of seminal figure in the Middle East that nobody seemed to properly understand.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this particular edition that I read actually was published in 1994. So a small disclaimer to our viewers and listeners that this covers Yasser Arafat's life from 1929 up to 1993-94. So it doesn't cover the last 10 years of his life, but we'll try and get to that as well. So how long did it take to actually get the book together, Andrew? So you said you started writing it in 1988. So would you say that 2 years is what it took to get the whole book together?
Yeah, about that. My day job was traveling around the Middle East, reporting on what was going on. Mm-hmm. And on the side, myself and my colleague Tony were researching this book. And we sat down, I guess in 89 at Tony's house in Cyprus to write it over several months. And it was a kind of curious process because, of course, as we were writing a book of history was changing. The Berlin Wall was falling and the Cold War was ending. And things like Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait were underway as well. So it was all a bit moving goalposts. I mean, one of my great regrets about the whole thing is we're not able to sort of come back to it and really redo it, especially at the time of Arafat's death, because so much had happened in the 10 years after the edition you referred to appeared. It's like it feels to me like unfinished business, but anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if better late than never. So if you and Tony do decide to put out another edition of the book that includes the last 10 years of Arafat's life, I can promise you that at least there's a couple of fans here on our show who would love to read that book, but we'll leave it up to you both to make that decision. Okay, so coming back to the book itself and Yasser Arafat's life story. He was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1929. And that's probably something that a lot of us who see Yasser Arafat probably wouldn't have associated that Egypt was his birthplace, given that he was Palestinian. So how did he and his family end up in Egypt, the place of his birth? Do walk us through that.
Well, I think that already at that time, there was a lot of fluid movement of people between Palestine, as it then was, and Egypt. His own family, they still had strong connections in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem, but they had moved to Cairo quite a long time before his birth. And he was in a milieu of nationalist circles in Egypt. So he found himself growing up there, mixing with Palestinians, but also mixing with the Muslim Brotherhood, because he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood for some time, and he went to university there, studied engineering. So his life was very much anchored in Egypt for that time. But he I think probably in later life, as we discovered in our researches, he tried to downplay his Egyptian aspects and claim more of a connection with Palestine. He spoke Arabic with something of an Egyptian accent. Of course, he would dispute being Egyptian, but he was already in his earlier life an indication of the spread out nature of the Palestinian diaspora. And it was very much an act of will on his part and on the part of people in his milieu and the people who he came into contact with later on, to create the idea of a Palestinian nation. I think it's fair to say that he was part of a milieu that was impacted by the growing sense of danger on the part of the Palestinian Arabs as the Zionist movement grew in force there during the 1930s and into the 1940s.
Right. And of course, 1948 was another pivotal year.
1948 was the catastrophe of Nakba.
Yeah.
It's imprinted on every Palestinian's mind even now.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's fast forward a little bit to 1959. So that was the year that he founded the Fatah organization. And at the time that Fatah was first created, was it a movement that was there to try and establish a separate Palestinian state alongside Israel, or were they looking to liberate all of Palestine from the Israeli occupation as they saw it? So do tell us about that.
So I think the important thing to think about in terms of the origins of the Palestinian movement that Arafat became the leader of is that it was the first movement that really saw the Palestinians as actors on their own behalf. So after the Nakba, the disaster of 1948, the Palestinians were scattered to various Arab countries. The Zionist movement was had created the state of Israel, and that was a growing success. And so it was a story of great depression on the part of Palestinians wherever they were. And from the point of view of a young Arafat, it was like, how do we make our own way? Arafat's answer to that was to go from Egypt to Kuwait and to seek work as an engineer. He qualified in engineering from Cairo University. Kuwait, of course, in the early days of the oil boom, was a prosperous place. He was able to earn a certain amount of money himself. He was overplayed that in later life by saying he owned several cars and he was a sort of millionaire. I think that was all a bit overblown. But anyway, he was there. He met some other colleagues who were there at the same time. Two of his closest lieutenants he met in Kuwait in the late 1950s. One of them was called Salah Khalaf, and the other one was Khalal Wazir. They were the trio who really established Fatah in the late 50s. And I think its central point that distinguished it from any of the other ginger groups of Palestinians being formed at the same time was, we're going to act on our own behalf. We're not going to be stool pigeons or puppets of Arab regimes. We don't want any independent actors usurping our position. So it was Arafat's great triumph to actually take over the PLO. PLO had been Palestinian National Movement, and then the PLO had been founded by the Arab governments as their sort of fig leaf to cover their embarrassment of having allowed the State of Israel to come into existence in the 1948 Arab-Israel War.
Yeah, absolutely. And so right after 1959, Andrew, there was another pivotal year in 1962 where the Algerians actually fought a 8-year war with the French occupying forces, and they've managed to successfully decolonize Algeria. So when we look back at that time in 2024, we see the Palestinians haven't really managed to get anywhere near to having a full-fledged state. But back in 1962, if you're Yasser Arafat and you see that a country like Algeria managed to successfully decolonize themselves, it wouldn't have been very far-fetched to think that the same could be done for Palestine. Would you agree with that?
I think one of the ways to think about the history of Arafat and the PLO is, they didn't have very many assets. In fact, they were disenfranchised. They were deprived of their homeland. They were going to go anywhere and ally themselves with anyone who would help them to achieve their or move towards their goal. And so the FLN in Algeria was one. The non-aligned movement more generally was another. And Arafat moved extremely energetically to position himself alongside these organizations and these movements, and to become core to them, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's talk about 1967, the year that the Six-Day War actually occurred in June, and where the Israeli forces dealt a decisive victory to the neighboring Arab states. How significant was that to Yasser Arafat's thinking, in the sense, given the fact that he had probably pinned some of his hopes on Nasser and his pan-Arabist movement actually going into Israel and perhaps helping to liberate Palestine? But it must have been quite a big setback for Arafat and his movement, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
I think that was an absolute pivotal moment, because Israel was under attack, but it actually fought back and conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So further conquest of Palestinian land, more Palestinian refugees, and also ultimately a sense of failure on the part of the Arab regimes. I mean, they were really caught napping. It was a 6-day war, and in those 6 days, led by Yitzhak Rabin, who may play a role further on in this conversation, but I mean, they conquered the whole of what they called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and it was like a second Nakba for the Palestinians, but it left Israel with a serious issue, which it's still trying and failing to deal with today. It left Israel in charge of an even larger subject population of Palestinians. And I think for Arafat, it was the pivotal moment, because it meant that it was even more clear that the Palestinians had to act on their own behalf. The Arab regimes had failed. Their failure had been graphically illustrated by the success of the Israeli conquest of the West Bank and Gaza, and the atmosphere in the Arab world for Arab governments after 1967 was abject. And Arafat and the Palestinians found themselves literally without a home, literally trying to find a way to pursue their own struggle. And that the history of the next few years was that.
Indeed. So let's fast forward a couple of years to 1970. So I believe that the impression I got from the book, Andrew, is that Arafat probably saw Nasser as a mentor of sorts, or perhaps a messiah of sorts, who could actually unite all of Arabia together, the Arab peoples and the nation states. In fact, Nasser tried to do that with Syria, with the ill-fated United Arab Republic, the union between Egypt and Syria. But 1970 was also the year that Nasser died and Anwar Sadat became the president of Egypt. And that was also the year that we had the infamous Black September war, the Jordanian Civil War. And of course, that meant that Arafat was getting into a lot of tussles with King Hussein of Jordan, who for a longest time was his rival, who was trying to compete with Arafat for leadership of the Palestinian cause. And you also had one chapter in the book entitled The Odd Couple, and I found that quite hilarious. Just the dynamics between King Hussein of Jordan and Yasser Arafat, the fact that they really hated each other, they didn't like each other, they just couldn't agree with each other on anything at all. So what do you think would be the reason for the lack of camaraderie between the two? Was it because they were just really different people, or do you believe that it was just their ideologies that just couldn't find any common ground to push this Palestinian cause together? Yeah.
No, I don't think it was really personal, although you'd have to say that, a king in a dynasty essentially founded by colonial Britain, and a self-styled revolutionary leader were not bound to be sort of bosom buddies. But on the other hand, the whole existence of Jordan was a conundrum, especially for the Palestinians after the loss of the West Bank. For the Palestinians, the West Bank, less so Gaza, but let's focus on the West Bank, was the core, or at least the seed, of a potential Palestinian state. That was gone. The Israelis had conquered it. So the next best version of a Palestinian state was right to the east, next door, in Jordan. Jordan, the monarchy of Jordan, as I've implied, was not necessarily terribly legitimate amongst its own population. In fact, its own population was divided. It was about less than, or just under 50% of the population of Jordan then, I'm not sure what it is now, but was Palestinian,
right,
or would define itself as Palestinian. So here's the king of Jordan, who's basically a Bedouin leader legitimized by colonial Britain, and something like 48% of his people are Palestinian, with allegiance to a non-existent Palestinian state. This was not a recipe for great stability, and that was at the root of what became a sort of civil war in Jordan in 1970-71.
Indeed, and I think that for our viewers and listeners, this is something to think about, that revolutionaries and monarchies really don't mix well together. The Jordanian monarchy back in those days, as well as in present day, even if they're a little ambivalent towards the Palestinian cause, or if they're a bit wary about the Palestinian cause, it's simply because they don't want to be overthrown by the revolutionaries. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's fast forward from 1970, Andrew, and obviously after the Palestinians had lost this Jordanian civil war, they had to find another host country. So they ended up in Lebanon, right? So
right.
Just out of curiosity, when the revolutionaries were in Jordan and when they were in Lebanon, you would think that they would learn from their lessons in Jordan that you shouldn't be walking around town with guns blazing, or at least showing off how powerful you are. But they did the exact same thing in Lebanon that they did in Jordan, as in, being very flashy with their weaponry and whatnot, which kind of really, got on the wrong side of the local population. So do you believe that this is actually a failure of leadership, or a failure on the part of Arafat to not actually learn from his mistakes? You do tell us your thoughts about that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very good question, but I think the premise of your question presupposes that Arafat was actually in control of the Palestinian movement, which I don't think he was at the time. I think the Palestinian movement was an extremely fractious. It was a very sort of fragmented coalition of guerrilla groups that had based themselves in Jordan after the 1967 war. There was not just Fatah, there was also the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all of these fractious groups. Long story short, he was always fighting to establish and then maintain a sort of primacy in the movement. A kind of further disaster for the Palestinians was being effectively chucked out as a political entity of Jordan and establishing themselves in Lebanon. It was a new low for them, And I don't think Arafat could ever have thought, oh, my recipe for survival now is to take a low profile in Lebanon and tell everybody to cool it and put their weapons away. No, this was an armed movement. This was an armed struggle, and the new front for the armed struggle was based in Lebanon. And by the way, in Lebanon, as we now see even more clearly than those days, it's a divided state. Now it's a failed state. So the Palestinians saw it as an opportunity to establish an even more entrenched and solidly defended homeland, or proxy homeland, than in Jordan. So that was the next chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really found the chapter on both Jordan and Lebanon, the chapters on Lebanon and Jordan to be really fascinating, especially the splinter groups, the different factions, and how split they are, not just within Fatah itself, but it's also a mirror to what Lebanon itself is, that you have the Druze leadership on one side aligned with the Muslims versus the Christian phalanges. So we would be doing a disservice to our viewers and listeners if we didn't spend some time on Lebanon. So let me just ask you a couple of questions with regards to Lebanon. So the Druze leader, Kamal Jumblat, was sort of, I think he was about 12 years senior to Arafat, and Arafat saw him as a mentor of sorts, somebody that he looked up to, as per what you wrote in the book. But hindsight is 2020, Andrew. But whenever we look back at Arafat's life, it seems that he always has his cart attached to the wrong horse. So when it comes to his relationship with Kamal Jumblat, would you say that he really did back the wrong horse? And why do you think that he was so taken by Kamal Jumblat? What was so special about him that he felt kind of mesmerized by him and just sort of went along with everything he said? Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, I think the Druze movement in Lebanon was and is an outlier. They've managed to maintain their independence, the sort of fierce independence from the general melee of Lebanese factional politics, and so as a fellow outsider, Arafat would have been drawn to that sort of group, and he was a warlord. Kamal Jumblat was a warlord. Arafat was not a warlord, but probably would like to have been a warlord. So I think for those reasons, he would probably have been drawn to the figure of Kamal Jumblat. Of course, after him came Walid Jumblat, who was a significant figure later on, and Arafat remained close to him. But I mean, the thing is, it's hard to define who is the right partner in Lebanon. Lebanon is a complete mess, and already in embryo was a complete mess in those days. So Arafat's view as a pragmatist, as a sort of tactical maneuvering person, was always, I'm going to ally myself with anybody who looks like a possible ally, whilst also hedging my bets with all the others. So that's what he did. He didn't sort of put all his bets on Kamal Jumblat. He had a complex network of relationships with a whole range of actors in Lebanon, and it enabled them to stay as a leader, or even build their presence in Lebanon, very significant between the early 70s and 1982, 3.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so just before we get to 1983, so let's wind back 1 year to 1982. And of course, that was the year that the Israeli invasion of Lebanon took place, led by Ariel Sharon. And the Israelis were, of course, allied with the Christian phalangists, who were another faction. And, you mentioned in the book that even though Ariel Sharon didn't directly commit the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, but the fact that he was actually he allowed it to happen, that he sort of enabled it because he didn't hold back the Christian phalanges. That's something that's really extremely controversial, which till this day, you have the Israelis on their side, giving their apology, acting as apologists for Ariel Sharon, whereas on this side you have the Palestinians who say that the Israelis, and Sharon in particular, was responsible for it. So he's even called the butcher of Beirut. from your vantage point in 2024, Andrew, how do you look back at that time period? Do you still hold Sharon responsible for what happened, or do you believe that he couldn't have possibly known what was happening because he just unleashed the CF, but he didn't really get the IDF to go ahead and do all that he was accused of doing? So do walk us through that.
Well, I think it's telling that you ask me from the point of view of 2024, because I actually think that Ariel Sharon was singularly responsible for what happened in Beirut, including the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Just as one could say that Bibi Netanyahu and his extremist war cabinet are responsible for the massive humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place in Gaza now. I mean, I think that, in a way, 1982 was the most pivotal year in this history from Israel's point of view. It was a military victory and a moral defeat on a grand scale. And of course, it was a defeat for Arafat and the Palestinians. Arafat eventually had to leave Lebanon, was ironically rescued under American protection in 1983 from the northern port of Tripoli and ended up in faraway Tunis. But it was a moral victory for the Palestinians. And one of the reasons it was a moral victory for the Palestinians was the uncontrolled butchery conducted by the Christian phalangists, tolerated or enabled by the IDF under Ariel Sharon. So I think, military victory and political and moral defeat for Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because I just finished reading his 800-page autobiography, and he has his own dynamics with Ariel Sharon, so they were political rivals. But when it came to 1982, he put it in his book that, Sharon couldn't be held responsible. How would he have known that the CF would have gone and committed these massacres? So it's interesting that they all closed ranks, but from an outsider's perspective,
of course.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Of course.
So,
but I mean,
sure,
if he didn't know, he should have known, and he should have suspected anyway that it was going to happen, because that's the dynamics of Beirut.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move ahead, fast forward a couple of years to 1987. So, of course, that was the year that the Intifada took place. So it wasn't something that was planned by Arafat and his fellow Fatah members. It was sort of like an indigenous uprising. So would you agree that, that is exactly how it was, or did they actually fan the flames from behind the scenes, given your 2024 vantage point? Do tell us about that.
No, I think even from our 1990 vantage point, it was clear. And I was a reporter for the Financial Times as the first Intifada got underway, and visiting Israel and Gaza and the West Bank at the time. And it was absolutely clear that this was a grassroots movement. It was as much, I might even say, an Intifada against Israeli rule as an Intifada against the PLO's lack of interest in the occupied territories. I think it's important to remember that the PLO, from its foundation, PLO as its foundation, as we already discussed, was an Arab government puppet organization. Fatah as a refugee Palestinian organization, because it was basically a representative of the refugees in the Palestinian refugee camps spread around the Middle East. It was an organization devoted to armed struggle. And to an earlier question that you posed that I didn't properly answer, it was devoted not to establishment of a Palestinian state against Israel, but to a Palestinian state, or rather, should I say, to a binational state, an Arab-Jewish state on the whole territory of Palestine. That was the goal, the founding goal of PLO, and the idea that Arabs and Jews would live together in
one democratic
state,
right.
In one democratic state. Yeah. I mean, nice idea, but very little focus, apart from as a locus for armed struggle activities, on the West Bank and Gaza. And I think the Palestinian inhabitants of those territories felt completely abandoned. I mean, they didn't, they sympathized, they supported armed struggle. They didn't really think it had much to do with them. Their lives was to do with how do we deal with Israeli occupation after 1967? Israeli occupation in Gaza had replaced Egyptian occupation. They were still a slave people, and in the West Bank, it was a deeply confused situation. To which the PLO, as an international actor, had very little say or do. So the Intifada was a new phenomenon. It was a phenomenon born of local activists saying we've had enough, and really doing establishing a classic local based protest movement, not with guns and grenades, but with stones and demonstrations. By the way, by now the PLO leadership was very far away. They were in Tunis, which is about
2,000 miles away.
In the world. And they actually read news reports of this with their eyes coming out on stalks. So they had to move very quickly to respond to it, and eventually to claim to be leaders of it, but they weren't leaders of it to start with.
Yeah. At what point, Andrew, did the PLO and Arafat come to the conclusion that they weren't going to be able to liberate all of Palestine? They wouldn't be able to get one democratic state, but rather they would have to share the land with Israel and go for a two-state solution. Would 1988 be that particular year, do you think?
I don't think you can pin it on a particular date or year. I think it was a realization that was reluctantly come to over a long period. And I suspect that Arafat, who was both a tactician and a strategist, but probably more of a tactician than a strategist. I mean, one of the criticisms that you can make of him, that he was so obsessed with maneuvering for survival for himself and as a leader, and for the movement more generally, that he only, as a secondary facet, had a strategy. I mean, and also, in fairness, I mean, I actually have some sympathy with this. If you're an exile movement with no assets, but people spread around the region, you're going to take whatever opportunities you can get, and strategy is a luxury. Your strategy is actually survival, right, and maintaining some sort of relevance. So he will and did attach himself to any development that seemed promising. So the latest one of those was the Intifada. And to your question, the Intifada brought into focus the role of the importance of the occupied territories, and probably consolidated in his mind the idea that that's going to be the route we're going to have to pursue. He probably already had that idea, but and it was in those years, by the way, that we started to research the book, and that's when Tony and I had a number of conversations with Arafat at various times, usually late at night, and his conversation was absolutely full of conversation about the occupied territories, and it was actually very pertinent then, but even more now, because he used to talk about it as a set of Bantustans. He used to talk about it in terms of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and I think it's one of my great sadnesses, if you like, about the Palestinian story, and he didn't manage to convey that effectively enough, because what we see now is an absolutely turbocharged version of the destruction of a viable idea of a Palestinian state. In those days, he would say, "We're not the Red." He would say slogans like, "We're not the Red Indians." It used to sound faintly absurd, but actually, when you think about it, he was making a very important point. And when he was talking about Bantustans, or a territory set up like a Swiss cheese, he was describing a very real reality, which was at the root of the Intifada. It wasn't taken seriously those points. But now those points can even more seriously be made.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, you mentioned your personal interactions with Yasser Arafat. So I have to take this opportunity to ask you a bit more about that, Andrew. How many times did you get a chance, both you and Tony, to sit with him for the book? So was he cooperative about the book, or did a lot of the information have to come from others besides him?
We saw him. We saw him 4 times, each in various different circumstances. To have a sort of set piece interview with him was a bit of a pantomime, because and this was in Tunis, and he was still living the life, or presenting the life, of a sort of fugitive guerrilla leader. So we would sit in a hotel in downtown Tunis and wait for the call, literally, and you'd say, well, we really want to see him, and they'd say, well, it might be tonight, it might be another night. Sit in your room by your phone, and somebody will be in touch. And of course, nights would go by, but nothing would happen. But on one of the nights in question, it would be you get a call about midnight, say it's going to happen tonight, and stand by. And then 2 hours later, you get another call saying there's a car about to arrive outside, and you go downstairs, and they put blindfold on you. And you get in the car, and you'd be taken to an unidentified location, and spend an hour talking with him. And it was really kind of bizarre, because he was both being present for an interview for the book, which he was, I would say, favorably disposed towards the idea of the book, but he was also holding court and performing for various courtiers who were coming in and out. So it was not really a very focused occasion. And so what you got was a parade of some of his slogans about Red Indians and Bantustans, but also a few comments about his early life. We asked him about his life in Kuwait, and he said, I was a millionaire, I had many cars, and it was all a bit, and one had the impression that he kind of said these things so often to so many people that he actually believed them. They weren't even true.
Okay.
But anyway, that was that. So to your point, I mean, of course, it was important for us to sit with him and to experience his presence and his style. But the factual and analytical base for the book was talking to everybody around him, because he was a performer and sometimes a sort of circus artist. But there were a lot of very serious people around him, and I would say, of the people that I met, the most serious of them all was Salah Khalaf, who went by the nom de guerre of Abu Iyad. And Salah Khalaf was basically the head of strategy for the PLO and the Fatah, and he was the chief ideologue. And he was also, though he never admitted it word for word, he was the founder and leader of the Black September movement, the terrorist movement that was responsible for various hijackings and eventually for the disaster at the Munich Olympics. And he spoke extremely articulately, and I would say quite movingly, about why they did those things. Never actually saying it was me, but you could read between the lines, to the point that, for example, he would say, well, if you take the Black September attack on the Munich Olympics, you had all the flags of all the nations of the world up there, and the only one missing was the Palestinian flag. So we had to make our presence felt. And rather interestingly, when we were researching the book, we also talked to the other side. We talked to many leading Israeli politicians and acting former heads of Mossad, and some of them would recognize in the Palestinian movement things that they had consciously and deliberately borrowed from the Zionist movement back in the mid 20th century.
And particularly Menachem Begin, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah.
He did mention Begin a couple of times, Arafat, saying that he learned a lot from him, right? Okay.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Palestinian movement, Fatah in particular, learned almost everything from studying the development of the Zionist movement,
right,
up to and including the establishment of democracy. They needed to have some kind of democracy within the Palestinian movement, modeled on that of the Zionist movement, and a sense of pragmatism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the running jokes in the book, Andrew, is that Yasser Arafat is very unpunctual. So you met him 4 times, and I have to ask, was he on time was he punctual in any of the 4 times that you met him for a meeting?
No, but the idea of punctuality is kind of irrelevant because he works on his time. Everybody else has to move to
Everybody
his
has
time.
to,
So,
go
what
with
we would
his
have called
time.
unpunctual, it was more like, okay, you're coming to lunch with Arafat. Lunch could be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You're going to arrive at 11 o'clock in the morning, and lunch will happen when he says.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
He's the king.
He's the king, yes. So if I were to ask you this, Andrew, given that he presided over a movement that wasn't able to achieve its goals, how do you think he would want to be remembered by history? And how exactly do historians view him today? If you could help us understand that. Yeah.
I think that on the first point, how would he like to be remembered? I'm pretty sure that he would want to be remembered as the person who kept the flame burning
right,
of Palestinian or aspirational Palestinian nationhood. I mean, that was the founding idea of Fatah in the late 1950s. Was we are a people, and we're going to try and make our own way. And we realize that there are Arab governments who kind of clothe themselves in our cause, but we don't trust them. We'll use their support and money as much as we can, but we don't trust them. We've got to make our own future. I'm pretty sure, and that was a consistent thread that I think he managed to maintain right up to the White House lawn, where he shook hands with Yitzhak Rabin in the presence of Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
So I think that's how he would like to be remembered. I think how historians will remember him as somebody who, having accepted all that, kind of fell short in actually delivering. And the moment, and I'm going to caveat this strongly by saying, I think that for me, the pivotal moment in terms of judging the Palestinian movement and even in judging Yasser Arafat was not of his doing, but what happened in Israel. And it was when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a settler extremist.
Right.
When I heard that news, I felt utterly gutted because it was the news to me that this was all going to fail. I mean, I did have a brief moment of hope as a result of the Oslo process and the handshake with Yitzhak Rabin and the establishment of those accords, that something might be done. But from that moment on, the Israeli side was bent on destroying any seed of progress. So I think historians will say he didn't deliver, but and probably they will also say he could have been more strategic by recognizing reality sooner. But it does require somebody on the other side to be able to talk to and make an agreement with. And I genuinely feel, I remember at the time speaking both to Arafat about this and to Rabin. I had for me a memorable interview with Rabin not long before he was killed, in which he spoke actually quite warmly of Arafat as somebody who was a serious partner, and at the same time, well, not exactly the same time, but in the same period, talking to Arafat, he described Rabin as a sort of de Gaulle of Israel. In other words, the person who could hand back an occupied territory with honor.
Yeah.
That seemed to be quite a genuine connection, but it was based on a thin platform.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. It's fascinating, and of course, right after Rabin died in 1995, so I think a lot of people probably forget that Benjamin Netanyahu actually came to power in 96. That was his first term as prime minister, so he was there till 99, and I suppose he had a big hand in torpedoing whatever Rabin had done up to that
Oh, for
point.
sure. No,
Yeah.
and Netanyahu, if there's a sort
Yeah.
of unequivocal villain in this story, it is Benjamin Netanyahu from beginning to end, including now. There's no end, sadly, but he has been single-mindedly working against any kind of feasible agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians from the moment he came into politics. He's a believer in occupying or maintaining control of the whole of Greater Israel, and the tragedy is he's been very skillfully maneuvering, in some cases covering his true intentions or deflecting comment on them all that time. But Netanyahu, let's be clear, Netanyahu is more responsible than anyone for the mess that is now unfolding in Gaza, including the October 7th attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really hard to look past Benjamin Netanyahu, so the pantomime villain, I suppose, in this story. So I would like you to just look into your crystal ball, Andrew, and just tell us, looking ahead 10, 15 years from now, given that there's 700,000 plus settlers in the West Bank and Gaza is completely destroyed and the people have nowhere to go, what is going to happen to the Palestinian cause 10 to 15 years from now? Do you believe that they will actually get a state, even though it seems very unlikely? Or do you feel that Israel will have to transform itself into one democratic state where every Jew and every Arab between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River have one man, one vote? So do tell us about that.
Oh my God, if I had the answer to that, I would probably be doing something completely different right now. No, I mean, this is the $64 million question, and I don't have an answer to it. But I will simply say this. I fear that the solution, the so-called solution that the whole world, especially the United States, is now saying this has to happen, is not going to happen, namely the two-state solution.
Right.
I don't see any semblance of evidence that would lead me to think that in the next couple of years or in the next 20 years, a two-state solution is going to happen. You mentioned the settlers and the increasing seizure of land in the West Bank, the destruction of Gaza, the views not just of the extreme right fringe of Netanyahu's government, Netanyahu himself, but also, across the spectrum of Israeli politics. You can't see even a sort of plausible minority in favor of a Palestinian state now. So, all this talk of we're going to now create, establish great momentum towards the establishment of two-state solution. We're going to have normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's for the birds. It's comfort talk, So I think there was an article by a couple of academics in Foreign Affairs, the US journal, just a week or so ago, saying that, and also saying it's an alibi for the US to talk about this, because as it's not going to happen, you might as well stop talking about it. You might as well start talking about the disaster, the catastrophe, the humanitarian nightmare that is happening in Gaza and to some extent the West Bank right now, and start holding Israel accountable for it. Because Israel is eventually going to have to come to terms with a very large number of Palestinian second-class citizens within its own rule, with its own democracy, so-called, and the occupied territories. The numbers. If you look at the numbers of Jews and Arabs in those territories, that is mind-boggling. So if you started holding Israel accountable for its treatment of Arabs, both within Israel and in the occupied territories, you start to have a real conversation. And it's a conversation which the current Israeli establishment would come out extremely badly from. And I recall when I was reporting about the Middle East, and I used to talk to, very senior Jewish figures in America about this. I said the moment where Israel will come under real challenge is when it's challenged about a human rights issue on the same grounds as the apartheid regime in South Africa was challenged there. And at that point, they would say, I think you have a point. That's the two-state solution is a bit of an alibi. It's a bit of a sort of sideshow.
Right.
I'm sad to say because
Exactly. I think it was Gideon. We actually had Gideon Levy on the show, and I think he was the one who said that the two-state solution is just a masquerade. It's never going to come true. So the only plausible thing to do going forward is to change the narrative from the Palestinian side and ask for civil rights, both within Israel as well as in the occupied territories. But a fascinating discussion, which I'm sure that can go on forever, and we can all, just guess as to how it might all end. But that was also the last question for the show, Andrew. Let me just grab the book from behind me and tell our viewers and listeners about it. The book, once again, is Arafat, the Biography by Tony Walker and Andrew Gowers. Fascinating book. I highly recommend it. So please do go out and buy it. I'm sure it's still in publication, correct, Andrew?
I hope you can. I think you might be able to find it on Amazon. All I would say is I wish I could sit down and sort of rewrite it with the last few chapters.
Right. And if you do decide to do that, we'll be the first to grab a copy, because I absolutely love how the book is not just a biography on Arafat, but it's also a chronological retelling of all the events over the past 90 to 100 years vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, Andrew Gowers, thank you so much for your time, sir. You've been a wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I really hope to have you back for a future episode, if and when you decide to come up with a new edition for the book. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Really appreciate it.
Very much.
Okay.